you decide to stop flying an airplane when you're getting ready to retire later on in life, you use aeronautical decision making to make sure that you make the right decisions and to make sure that you get to your destination safely. And aeronautical decision making reimagined is a concept that one of the best CFIs I've ever met came up with and has taught us at Palomar Aviation on how to use that to break down our decision making process even further so we can make micro decisions so we can get to our destination safer. So we're going to talk about that today. Just as always, this is supposed to start a discussion. It's not supposed to be considered formal flight instruction. If you need formal flight instruction, you want to learn more about ADM, you can go to your local CSIP or TCI at your Cirrus Training Center, or find your local independent CSIP on the Cirrus Locator app. The FAA also has a lot of really good resources for ADM information. As always, we're also willing to help you out, and we'd love to help you out at Palomar Aviation. We do Zoom and Skype training over the internet during this interesting time that we're all going through. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with the presentation. It's going to be a really good one. As a flight instructor, this is something that I think is so incredibly important for students to understand, but also to always continually enhance their ability to make decisions. So aeronautical decision making, ADM Reimagined, is an objective to understand the concept of aeronautical decision making and start a discussion on how to make better decisions. Today we're going to cover what is ADM, what personal minimums are, get their itis, ADM Reimagined. We're going to talk about some scenarios and how to learn from your mistakes, because as a pilot, you learn most from your mistakes. And then we're going to take any questions and have a discussion on ADM and talk about any scenarios that pilots may have encountered, or if they are worried about encountering them, how they can make a good decision throughout their career flying airplanes. So let's talk about what aeronautical decision making is. ADM is a systemic approach to risk assessment and stress management. And ADM is also an understanding of how personal attitudes can influence decision making and how those attitudes can be modified to enhance the safety in the flight deck. So simply put, aeronautical decision making is a systematic approach that us pilots use in the training environment, in the professional environment, in the recreational Part 91 environment. And it's a process that we use to figure out whether the pilot is fit for flight, the pilot can make the flight safely, the airplane is fit for flight, and the airplane can make the flight safety throughout the entire journey. And it encompasses a multitude of topics, from a checklist called like I'm safe, to figure out whether the pilot is sick, to making sure that the airplane is in working conditions, to making sure all the inspections and any other important pieces of information are up to date in the airplane. You're checking the weather in all different parts of the flight, from departure to arrival and everything in between, to make sure that the weather is within your limitations and with the airplane limitations and within a safe margin. You don't want to be going into a thunderstorm because you need to get there. You want to make sure that you give yourself a way to either not make that flight, or a way to get to your destination safely without having to go through a bad storm, or to fly an airplane that you're concerned isn't incredibly airworthy. So ADM is an approach that we teach pilots and we learn as aviators on how to make these decisions. And it talks about personal attitudes. There are a lot of hazardous attitudes you learn throughout your flight training. And there's a lot of pilots out there who fly with these hazardous attitudes because of various reasons. And you want to understand these hazardous attitudes so you can identify when you are, in fact, having one of these hazardous attitudes, and how you can backtrack, get yourself out of that mindset, and then go back to a safer decision-making process. So that's a lot of what ADM is. So we talked about personal minimums, and this is one of the most important aspects of aeronautical decision-making, is personal minimums. Does anyone know what personal minimums are? Aiden, you want to touch on personal minimums just a little bit?
Personal minimums are, I guess in a nutshell, would be the minimums that you've set for yourself that would probably be much more restrictive than, say, what the FAA has as an absolute minimum. For example, our fuel requirements. Well, as we know, we require an extra 30 minutes for fuel reserves during day flight and 45 minutes for night flight. Now, you could say that a personal minimums for, say, fuel reserves, you could say I want to have an hour during the day and an hour and a half during the night, just so that you have that extra safety buffer so that you're not just pushing the bare minimum.
Right. And, the fuel personal minimums is one of the examples that you hear the most in aviation because, 30 minutes of fuel is not a lot at the end of the day. And when you possibly might need to go to a destination that's a little bit more than 30 minutes away, even if it's a VFR day, there could be a problem at the airport. You want to be able to make sure that you're still able to make that flight, and setting personal minimums on the ground to make sure that if you get into a problem in the air, it's already been thought of. So the fuel one is really important to think about as you're starting your flight training, but it encompasses everything. So weather, you might have a crosswind personal minimum. The airplane has demonstrated crosswind components, but you might not feel comfortable going all the way up to the demonstrated crosswind component. So, in the Cirrus, it's depending on the model, it's in the 20 knot range, but you might only feel comfortable flying in 10 knot crosswinds, especially in Southern California, where sometimes there's really no wind to deal with when you're coming in on approach. But you go to another state such as Florida and there's crosswinds all over the place and you're not comfortable flying in them and you didn't anticipate it. So then you're trying to figure out in air on approach what you're going to do, whether you're going to try to land in a crosswind or if you're going to try to divert to another airport. And it's important to set your personal minimum for that on the ground so that decision's already made for you. You never want to be in the airplane trying to make these decisions based off what you feel in that moment. You want to predetermine what you feel comfortable with on the ground so you can stick by what you decided already. So, and they can change from flight to flight. You just need to make sure you establish it on the ground and that you're not changing it depending on how, just kind of what people are telling you. It's how you personally feel. So your personal minimums are set by you. That's an important aspect to setting a personal minimums. It could be either the pilot in command, or if you're in a training environment, the student can set their personal minimums. Students are encouraged to go to their flight instructors and say, today is not a day that I would normally go fly by myself. I don't think we should do a dual flight. And that is showing the flight instructor that you're making good aeronautical decisions and you're using ADM to make your decisions by setting personal minimums. And that's going to go a long way in your flying career. They say all the time, there's bold pilots and there's old pilots, but there's no old pilots. So you need to make sure that you're using good ADM to make these decisions, and having personal minimums on the ground is a first step to making good decisions. And one of the biggest things is if you're not comfortable flying, don't go. And if your personal minimums are different than the airplane, don't ever feel pressured by external pressures to go flying because, well, the demonstrated crosswind component is 21 knots, but you only feel comfortable flying in 10 knots. And the person that you're flying with might feel comfortable flying in more wind, but you're the one who's renting that airplane. So you have to understand, how things affect you and understand the relationship between pilot and command and whoever else is flying in the airplane with them. Just because you're with the CFI doesn't mean the CFI says, this is what we're doing today because I said so. If the student's uncomfortable, they are expected to say something about it. So another hazardous attitude, and something that happens a lot in aeronautical decision making, is pilot Alpha in Carlsbad. We're taxiing out and we have basically just a strong cover of fog, and it broke off about 2,000 feet in the air. But if a pilot's not instrument rated, the gentleman I was flying with that day was instrument rated. I'm instrument rated as a flight instructor. This airplane is really capable. So we were going to Van Nuys. Was it a case of get their itis? No, because everything we had talked about on the ground during our pre-brief is exactly what happened. We departed IFR. We broke out of the clouds. We were VFR over top. We were coming back into land and Van Nuys. The fog started to break off a little bit. So we went from this departure to completely VFR landing less than an hour later. But if you don't think about it, and there's different conditions along the route of flight than you expected, and you just push through, it creates a hazardous situation and a hazardous attitude that can lead to potential problems down the road. If you say, I have to be in Houston, Texas, and I'm leaving San Diego on Tuesday. I have to be in Houston by Wednesday. And from Tuesday to Wednesday, there's a huge storm system rolling through, and you're thinking, okay, well, I'll just ride the back of it. But you start to catch up to it, or you end up flying into some bad weather. You hadn't planned for it. Now you're in the airplane trying to find an alternate. You're trying to figure out whether you need to divert. You're trying to reset up a FMS system to get you to your destination or to wherever you need to go after that. You can get very behind the airplane, and that's a situation that starts to cause accidents and incidents with pilots, because they didn't do their homework on the ground. They had get-there-itis, and they really needed to either not go or take an airliner to get to where they need to go. If you own an airplane, you can afford an airline ticket to get you to your destination if your airplane can't get you there. And that's something that pilots all the time struggle with is, well, I need to get there. My airplane can get me there. But is it the safe thing to do? It might not be. You know, I have almost 700, 800 hours in serious aircraft. I was flying one a couple of days ago, and I delayed my departure by a day to let a storm system roll through the southeast. And that night, the storm system that I said, well, I might be able to get around it to the north, was the one that produced all those tornadoes in Mississippi. And I could have been in the air dealing with that. And at 16,000 feet, you're getting thrown around in all that storm. And then I would have been diverting to, someplace else. And my trip goes all haywire. I'm trying to find a hotel. I'm trying to think about lodging. Is the FBO even open right now? These are all things by making one decision that you now subsequently have to talk about and decide and figure out because of the one decision you made on the ground before you even took off, just if things don't go to plan. An airline or something like that. So if you don't have the option of taking an airliner, something else you could do to avoid a potentially hazardous thought process is just delay your departures, like I was talking about before. And this leads us into ADM Reimagined. So ADM Reimagined is a concept used. Say it one more time.
Well, why don't you pause your video? We have a little bit of a delay in some of your audio coming across. So pause your video, please. I think we'll hear you a little better on bandwidth. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry about that. So ADM Reimagined is something that our pilots use to prevent get-there-itis, but also to become more efficient in their thought-making process. And the objective of ADM Reimagined is to break down the sections of your flight into small segments in which you can ask yourself various questions about if you can continue the flight. Some of the questions might include, can I stay VFR for 15 minutes? Will I have at least 5 miles of visibility when I go flying? And something that everyone needs to think about is that VFR is a legal minimum. You do not have to go flying just because it is VFR. So if you only need 3 miles of visibility, but you've never flown in 3 miles of visibility, and you're out there flying an SR-22 turbo going 170 knots true, you're going really quick, and you're not necessarily able to see what's coming up ahead of you if you're a VFR-only pilot. So you want to make sure that you have your personal minimums, but if part of your flight goes through adverse conditions, are you capable of doing that flight? Is that within your personal minimums? Are you an instrument-rated pilot? Flying through 4 miles of visibility through a valley could be potentially dangerous, especially if you're coming into approach and you're unfamiliar with the area. So ADM Reimagined aims to break down your flight into small sections in which you ask yourself questions in order to get yourself to an outcome that is the safest for you. So these are some scenarios that you might be talking about during ADM Reimagined. So is my departure at personal minimums? And here are 2 more questions that would come from that. Is my initial climb out keeping me clear of adverse conditions? Is my initial cruise going to keep me clear from adverse conditions? And then as you're going long distances, you have your first part of your cruise flight, and then you get to your about halfway point, and then you ask yourself again, is my descent going to keep me clear of adverse conditions? And you can think of yourself as adverse conditions as, well, I want to just avoid thunderstorms. Someone else might say, well, I want to avoid turbulence. Another pilot might say, I want to make sure that I don't go into clouds. The questions that you ask yourself are purely based off what a pilot can ask themselves personally, because everyone else is going to have different questions. These are just some examples that you might have for ADM Reimagined. Another one is, what's an alternate route I can take? Then what's my alternate airport if I'm going north instead of south to go on my trip? Does it change the required fuel on board? Because, you know, there's the legal minimums, there's your personal minimums, but also it's never a good feeling landing your airplane less than what your personal minimums are. So you want to make sure that if there's required fuel changes based off of your trip or different winds, you want to make sure you update that as well in your flight plan and take the extra consumables on board as needed. And then, do I need to push up or move back my flight? What's the weather on different days? Is my date a firm date? If you have a business meeting that you have to get to on a Thursday in, you know, Northern California, but you wanted to leave Wednesday, the weather Wednesday is really bad, and then you can't leave Tuesday because you have another business meeting in another part of the state. You know, a lot of the people flying Cirrus aircraft, they're not professional pilots who are, their jobs are to get people from point A to point B, like an airliner would be. You're recreational pilots. You have good piloting skills. You have a great airplane, but is it something that's designed to go through a storm like a 737 is? No. You have anti-icing and de-icing equipment, but is it designed to go through the type of ice that a 747 would go through? No. So if you have these conditions along the route of flight, you need to make sure that you understand your capabilities, your plane's capabilities, but also what are my alternatives? Because as always, sometimes the safest option is to take that plane with two professional airline pilots who have trained to fly in bad weather and to get you from point A to point B, regardless of the weather conditions outside. So those are some of the scenarios that you might have with ADM Reimagined, and some questions you might ask yourself while you're doing your flight planning. So some scenarios. ADM applies to every aspect of flying, and you use ADM on every step of the flight. So scenario one, you're starting the airplane, and Aiden, I'd love you to chime in on this one. So you're starting the airplane, you notice a faint smell of fuel. What would be your thought process to figure out whether you're continuing your flight or whether you need to turn the airplane off and fly another day?
As far as if I were to smell fuel during the start, I would go from, say, looking outside to verify that my fuel caps were tightened down, and then from there, maybe waiting a second, letting the engine run for a minute or two to see if that fuel smell goes away. And if the fuel smell remains as strong, or if it even increases in strength, then I might shut down and then have maintenance look at the aircraft.
Right. And that's the appropriate thing to do, but having a hazardous attitude such as get there itis, or I need to get this flight done because I have a check ride coming up, it might promote the thought in your head, well, it's just a faint smell of fuel, it'll go away. The fuel caps are tight, you know, we started up, it's not going away, but, you know, someone could have just spilled some fuel on their pants when they are sumping the gas. But it's because you have this attitude of, I need to make this flight, that you're now potentially departing with an airplane that might have a fuel problem. And you don't know what that is until you get out of the airplane, check to see if there's a leak, or to check to see if, you know, there's some sort of problem, or whether someone just did spill fuel on themselves. In scenario two, you're en route and you encounter some unexpected weather. And so the decision-making process for me personally on what I would do in that situation is I would talk to air traffic control and ask them if there's a hole anywhere through the weather. You're talking to air traffic control. If you're not, you really should be en route on a long cross country on VFR flight fall, and if you're on an IFR flight plane, or talk to someone anyway. And so I'm going to ask them, where's the hole that I can get through? And if there's not, you have all these resources available in the Cirrus aircraft. You can go to the nearest page. You can go on your moving map, and you can just find the airport that looks best for you. And then you really want to figure out on the ground, if you do need to divert, what type of airport are you looking for to divert to? You don't want to divert to, if you're trying to go to San Diego and you can't get in because the weather is fogged in. You don't want to divert to Borrego Valley where you're stuck in the middle of nowhere with no services available. What happens if the airport you decide to land at has no fuel and you need more fuel because there's now strong headwinds on the way to your rest of your destination? So you want to have a list of airports along the way that you can say, okay, if I need to stop there, I can stop there. But if I don't need to, I can continue to go on the trip. But you're not trying to figure this out in the air while you're trying to deal with another problem like unexpected weather. And Aiden, if there's ever been a situation that you've been in, I'd love you to share that where you had to make a decision in the airplane. Either as a student or a CFI, where you used something like this to make the right decision.
Well, I think it was my first or second instrument training flight. My instructor and I, we had checked the weather. We had made sure that it was going to be good for the flight out to. We were going to Long Beach to just practice some cross-country stuff for instrument procedures. We had checked the weather for the flight to Long Beach and the flight back from Long Beach to Palomar, and the weather looked good. There was not going to be any IFR weather according to the TAF or any other forecast that we were looking at. So we figured, okay, this flight's going to be safe. We're going to have good weather, and we'll be able to make it in. As we're on the return journey, we're about over Dana Point, in between Dana Point and Oceanside VOR, and we start listening to the ATIS. And then next thing we know, we're listening to the ATIS, and it says that the cloud ceiling is 200 overcast, and it is 1/2 mile visibility. So my instructor and I decided at that point we were going to attempt to shoot the approach. And because we have the ILS, occasionally when the weather is that low, you can get in. Now, we shot the approach. We got all the way down to minimums. The runway was not in sight, so we ended up doing a missed approach. After the missed approach, we had to quickly collect our thoughts and figure out where we wanted to go as an alternate. We chose Ramona because we knew some people that lived over there, so we knew we'd have a place to stay. And then also, if the weather were to improve, we could get back quickly.
Yeah. So, and I think everyone as they're training has a story of something like that happening, whether it be fog over in Southern California, or when I was training over in Florida, we had thunderstorms all over the place. And this was probably the flight that made me realize how important aeronautical decision making was. So it was a night instrument flight, and my instructor and I decided to try to go around a thunderstorm on our way to this northern central Florida, Ocala area, to shoot some approaches. And we're shooting a VOR approach, and it was a good flight. And we're on our way back to our home airport, and there's this. It's late at night, so we don't really expect a huge thunderstorm. But there's just this massive, just red cell just sitting over the airport. So we're coming in and we're turning on the base leg for our approach, and they're giving us our vectors and everything like that. And they switch us to tower, and tower goes, "Good evening, area of moderate to extreme precipitation, 12 o'clock, like directly ahead of you." And we're getting thrown around in this airplane. And I decided I'm going missed, and we're going to another alternate airport. It was just in that moment, but we had predetermined what our alternate was, even though legally we didn't need to go to our alternate, or we didn't even need to file an alternate based off the forecast. We broke off the approach right at the final approach fix. We asked for radar vectors to another airport, spent the night at my parents' house, flew back the next day, and I had to buy a new pair of pants. But that was a very hard lesson to learn. And my instructor had told me at the start of the night, he goes, "Well, maybe we shouldn't." And I said, "No, we need to get this flight done. And because it was a hazardous attitude, I have a check ride coming up." So it goes back to, you learn the most from your own mistakes. I put myself in that situation. I learned from that mistake. And now when my students have the same kind of thought process that I did when I was a student, I know how to kind of guide them in the right direction. But at the end of the day, and I know Aiden definitely has a really great ability to do this, to kind of guide his students along to get the right answer that we know is the right answer, but we need to teach you how to get there. And, Aiden and Nick both do an excellent job teaching their students aeronautical decision making. We have one student who He really wanted to go fly, and we spent and he talked to other instructors, and now he's ready for a check ride because he makes good ADM and has good ADM skills. So if anyone has any questions, Aiden, I would like you to touch one little bit on anything else, ADM related that you think your students really need to focus on, especially when they're first starting off in their flying career.
I can't think of anything at the moment.
So what are some of the hazardous attitudes that you think your students struggle with the most when they're first learning to fly?
I would say probably the biggest one is not necessarily get there right, because we're not going anywhere, but the feeling of I need to get this flight done, because the more flights that I do, the quicker I'm going to get to, say, to my private pilot license, my instrument license, that kind of thing. So at kind of the beginning of training, you'll notice a lot of students will tend to fly in, say, less than favorable conditions, just so that they can get the flights done. Right.
And, every pilot out there has gone through points in a flight where they think, or they're second guessing themselves, or, they could take off in less than ideal conditions, and, they get on the ground and they talk about, it's always better to wish you were up there down here than wish you were down here while you're up there. And that's 100% true. And, as you're training, you have different situations. So if any of the participants today have any situations that they'd like to share and the lessons that they learned from their, bad decision that they made, we'd love to hear about them and talk about how you got to the realization that you had made the bad decision.
Brian, one thing that I heard you say during the presentation, which I think really resonates, is you don't need to make a decision to go all the way to the destination. Your decision is to fly yet another 15 minutes and another,
right.
15, and another 15 minutes. And I think that's a real simple concept, but it's extremely telling. And so
right.
many people, start to envision what their destination airport looks like, the destination restaurant they're heading towards, the destination meeting, versus can I fly 15 minutes in good conditions, in VFR conditions? Can I remain clear of clouds, even when I'm on an IFR flight plan? I think that's a
right.
great way.
And it's even if you can change it to VF if you don't mind going into clouds, or if you hate turbulence, because you think about how hard turbulence can be on your body when you're flying these long flights. You're just kind of sitting there getting bounced around, you get sore, and as you kind of get into that feeling of I just want this flight to be over with, you might, when they start to descend, you just keep your throttle open and you start to descend into the yellow line. If you're going through rough air, that could be bad for your airplane. So there's just one little thought process of breaking it up into 15 minutes can change the whole course of your flight, because you're not just trying to okay, I just need to get from here to here. It's these small intervals. And if you get to one of these intervals, and you can think of it like a circuit breaker. If you get to it and you don't like what you feel, the circuit breaker pops and your flight's done for that moment. And that's a really good way to think about it, because if you give yourself these predetermined intervals of how long I need to go in these conditions to still feel comfortable, and as I said before, it's different for everybody on what their questions that they ask themselves are, but that is really important. So it is 5:32. I do really appreciate everyone joining us today, and I hope that you learned some valuable information on it. If you have any questions on ADM Reimagined, I'd be more than happy to help you guys out. You can get a hold of me, Brian at palomaraviation.com. And then Aiden as well. If you go to our website, palomaraviation.com, we have all of our information for our flight instructors, TCI, CSIPs, our airplane. Be more than happy to help you out via Zoom, in person, over FaceTime, however you want to do that. These Zoom calls are recorded and put on our website. If you want to watch one of the older ones, they're all up there at the very bottom of the Zoom page. And we do appreciate everyone's participation. These have gotten a really good reception since we started them. I think it's been well over a month now that we've been doing these 2 times a week. So I just wanted to say thank you for everyone being an active participant. We see a lot of the same people all the time. So from Palomar Aviation, thank you for that. And then next week, or Thursday, we're going to have some good presentations. Nick is going to be joining us for that one. and we do have our schedule online at the on our website. And then last but not least, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to be your flight instructors and your CSIPs. We are starting to ramp up our training again out there. So if you are interested in flying 974 Pop Alpha, the beautiful airplane right over Aiden's shoulder, Aiden would be more than happy to take you up and get you flying and show you the amazing Perspective Plus in the G6 aircraft. But I know a lot of our students are eager to get back into it, so we're excited for everyone to join us flying again. I hope everyone has a good rest of your day, and we will see you Thursday, 2 p.m. Pacific.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thanks, Brian.
Do you want me to
See you, John.
down here?
Thanks,
See you,
Brian.
John.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Okay. Good to know. 'Cause I might have to
Brian.
review